Hello and welcome to the Reflection Pool podcast produced by the Vernal Pool, UC Merced's undergraduate creative arts journal. My name is Cassandra, and today I am joined by Samantha Tetangco, the Associate Director of UC Merced's writing program. Together, we will discuss some of the past and present work from Samantha, as well as any advice for student writers. Samantha, can you share with our audience a bit about where you're from and how you were introduced to writing?
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
So I was born in Ohio and I lived in Oregon, but I mostly grew up in Merced. I was here through first grade through senior year of high school, and I left for 20 years before coming back to work here at UC Merced. And how did I start writing? I think I can't even tell you how I started. My memories of myself as a very young girl were always with me trying to write a novel, always scribbling in notebooks, really attaching to any creative writing-esque assignment in any of my classes. So I think in some ways I was always circling around that question about, could I do this in the long term?
So little Samantha, do you have any of your works from your childhood?
I don't. I am somebody who I get really embarrassed about things that I wrote, like to the point where when I was probably in like 8th grade, I would like tear things up into itty bitty tiny pieces before putting them in the trash can, and sometimes like putting them in separate bins because I was so paranoid about somebody reading some of the things that I had written. Yeah, now I keep everything, and it's takes up a lot of space.
It's always interesting, the things that we keep and the things that we release when it comes to the work that we create.
Yeah. I mean, I know some people who they keep their journals, There's somebody who reads a lot of journals of writers that have been published posthumously. Is that how you say that? Posthumously. And I've never said that word aloud before, I'm realizing. And and I've never been someone like that. My personal journals, I'm like, I hope nobody ever reads them.
Same.
But drafts of things, I've had enough experiences of computers crashing and losing drafts, of warning stories. Like one of the first creative writing classes I took was with Maxine Hong Kingston, and she told us the story about how the Oakland fires broke out in the hills and she lost her full, pretty much complete manuscript and had to rewrite it. And so she really emphasized the importance of backing up yourself, emailing yourself your work. So now I'm a little obsessive about keeping old drafts to the point where it's gone the opposite direction, where if I do lose a draft, I have no idea what version is the one that's the one to use. I should probably get better at that.
So how was your journey navigating academia as a writer?
Oh yeah, oh boy, that's a really good question. This is gonna get a little bit heavy because I run this anti-racist pedagogy group, co-facilitated with Eileen Campfield here on UC Merced campus. We work with faculty across disciplines, and I actually gave a presentation about this last week. And one of the things that I talked about is the problem of being a good student in a system that centers whiteness. And so this is a long answer to navigating being a writer in an academic setting, because so I got into graduate school barely by the skin of my teeth, applied to a dozen places, got into one on a wait list, and then I just harassed them I really want to go here. I really want to go here. Here's some extra stories, read them. And so I was tipped to anyone on a wait list. If you do that, they bump you to the top of the wait list. So I got bumped to the top of the wait list, and I got in. It was one of the best experiences of my life. Really important for me in my formation as a writer. Worked with amazing mentors, had amazing fellow writer. So I say all of that because I don't want anybody to hear this and think that it wasn't an amazing experience and it wasn't important for me. I mean, I'm the associate director of a writing program now. Like, clearly, I got a lot out of it, but there's been a lot of undoing. So I finished that program in 2011. And so it's been over 10 years of me trying to figure out, like, what does my writing look like after? And this is a long way of saying the whole there's been a shift recently in creative writing that I wish had happened when I was starting back in 2007. And so, for those who've been in a creative writing workshop, you kind of know the process where you, like, at least I don't know if this is how people are still doing it here at UC Merced. I think some people are, and some people are changing things up, which I'm excited about. But the Iowa workshop model, where somebody brings in a story to get workshop, everyone in the class reads that, and then they all kind of tell that writer how to change it and make it better, right? Process that taught me a lot. As one of my professors said, you can always get what you need to get from a story by yourself, but it will usually take you years to have the perspective you need to make the improvements that you need, and a workshop can speed that process up. And the workshop reads a bunch of craft essays that talk about what a story should do, and then those craft essays help inform what people say to those writers who are up. So as a queer woman of color, I had a mostly heteronormative kind of experience. I think there was one other queer person in the room, maybe one or two other people of color in the room. But all of the scholars we were reading, they were all like Midwestern, white scholars telling us what from Aristotle onward, right? So I think one of the things that happened was that my writing, because I'm a good student, and this started as an undergrad, same process as an undergrad, where I had to apply to get into classes. So it was highly competitive. I went to UC Berkeley, and I, again, got a lot of experience, but there was like a real competitive, like the fact of having to apply to get in already, like I had to apply twice to get in to one creative writing class. And then, it did something similar kind of process, but I'm a good student. I'm a person who likes to rise to challenges. So I would take feedback and I would respond to it, like all of it. I would try to do the best I could to be the best writer I could based on these people who told me what it meant to be a good writer. And in the process, by the end of my MFA program, I was writing about a lot of Midwestern white men. Right? So I started writing these super queer, like very queer stories about like things that were happening with people and people that I had been in a community with in San Francisco. And then, and I would have people just do the thing that workshop people do. I don't really understand why they do that. I want to know more about this. Like, tell me more about this. And I would respond to all of those things. And the result was, I mean, if I were writing toward a queer audience, I probably wouldn't have to explain like why we were all in a bar, right? Like that's such a part of that queer culture, right? Or like I had like a group of friends that were interdating. And I was writing about it because I was like fascinated by it. I had a friend that I worked with, and she had this circle of friends that had been together as a friend unit for like a dozen years, and they'd all like dated each other at one point in time. And I was like, how does that work? Like, how do you, and I was sort of newly out of a closeted relationship, and I was like exploring what my own identity meant. And so I was like kind of observing them and like wondering about them and trying to figure out if I fit in and trying to answer questions about myself, like through this exploration of what a group like this might work like. And so it just a workshop where people don't understand what community you're writing to can do damage. So I think that's like, and again, I think there's a really good shift happening in the creative writing world right now. There's been a lot of talk about this. This year, there were like 2021, there were 2 books that came out that a lot of people have been reading. Like one is Felicia Chavez's Anti-Racist Writing Workshop, I think it's called. And then the one that I really responded to the most is Matthew Salacy's Craft in the Real World, which actually UC Merced's creative writing people are doing a whole I guess like a pedagogy exploration, working together to like rethink how we've all been taught to think about creative writing. So there's really cool changes, but I think that's, for me at least, navigating academia was like, how do I put the part of me that's a really good student who wants to do well, who's an overachiever, with the person who had a story to tell. And now I've lost those stories and I'm trying to find new ones because I can't really go back to like the psyche of the person I was in my mid late 20s now that I'm 40, right? Like I have different things that I care about and obsess over.
Yes. Thank you for that. I noticed on your cover letter that you've been doing some grant writing. What inspired you to utilize your writing to gain funding?
Friend, phenomenal poet named Keen Lamb, and he was a poet who always played a bunch of video games. So he spent most of his graduate school days, I'm not sure if he tells everyone this, it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone really, playing video games. Like he'd be up all night, he'd just play video games, and he would somehow, like, I don't know when or where or how, like write these like just like heartbreaking, amazing poems. And he's doing really well as a poet, but he makes a living by working with some big gaming company that does writing about like video game tournaments.
Nice.
And so he's like a sports journalist, but about video gaming.
Nice.
So he'll text me sometimes. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm in Italy right now," and I'm like, I hate you. I hate you. Yeah.
So, what is an average day like as the associate director for the writing program at UC Merced?
Oh man. What can I say about that? Like, what publicly can I? I'm just kidding. The Merritt writing program is huge. It's got 60 plus faculty members and teach all of the composition and most of the upper division writing and lower division writing classes on this campus. So, with 60 plus people teaching 2 to 3 classes a semester, that's quite a bit with a bunch of students, 20 students. So lots of students. We like do a lot of work. So I think there's always, what I like about this job is no day is the same. So some days are days where there's a lot of like crisis, like there's a lot of like things happening with students that faculty members have to respond to. And so there's a lot of connecting people to the right resources so they can get those resources to students. There's a lot of like meetings like that are held that help with communications, like how do we, like different processes that are happening. Like I'm working right now on a new writing placement model for incoming freshmen who come in, and it used to be like a timed writing test that like helped students know if they go to writing 1 or writing 10, which are our first 2 writing courses. And this is a new model that does a whole bunch of different stuff that I won't get into because it would take a long time. So it can range from like a project to like working with faculty or like observing faculty or scheduling classes. I don't do the scheduling, but people talk to me about scheduling, then I got to find out information about that. That is a really bad explanation of like what I do, but hopefully that gives a little bit of a sense of it. There's a lot of strings that happen behind the scenes to make sure that our faculty are supported in the work they do in their classroom.
So your novel Between Here and Nowhere is currently seeking representation. How has the process of seeking representation and getting your book in the hands of readers been?
Yeah, that's been really hard. I mean, so I talked about this at the beginning about, part of my understanding of the impact of what I was explaining about being a good student and trying to make adaptations. So that book, Between Here and Nowhere, it started out with the title Bruised. And I think you can like the shift from a title called Bruise that was a first person present tense narrator. It took the point of view of a character named Jackie, who was based off that friend that I told you about with the circle of friends. And my friend had told me this story about her and her friends in a car driving to Denver. We were in New Mexico. We were in Albuquerque at the time. And she'd gone to sleep and she'd woken up and she saw that they had driven south instead of north. And that story had stuck with me. So that's how the book began. Like, who are these friends in this car heading in the wrong direction? It seemed like a metaphor for like kind of how I had felt at that time. And by the time and it was all Jackie, and Jackie was a mess. Like, she drank too much. She cheated on everybody she dated. She, basically everything good in her life, she destroyed by like loving everything too much and like kind of not trusting that something could stay good. And by the time I graduated, that book had gone through many drafts and it became Between Here and Nowhere, 4 different point of view characters, including the opening character. The book now opens with this character named Michelle, who is married to a man and had been having an affair with Jackie, and was trying to sort her own, like, what the hell am I doing kind of question. Like, what does this mean about my identity, right? So you can see a shift here. The first version of the novel was a queer book for queer people. And then this narrator, one of the things I've come to understand is that I love that character. I love her story. I love her scenes. I love her arc. But what I've come to understand is, like, I inserted her for my straight audience who needed a guide into like what queerness might mean by having this sort of coming out of the closet. I have a real resistance to coming out stories. I had always had it, because I feel like they're usually, I think they're important for like one part of one's queer identity, and then you come out and there's a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yes.
And I realized I was putting her in there because people responded to her the most. So it was like my classmates, my teachers, they were like, I really love this character. I really connect to this character. And I'm like, well, of course you connect to that character. It's the only one that is somewhat like you, right? And so this is a long way of saying it took me a lot of failed attempts at getting that book published, to come to the conclusion I've come to, which is that, like, I should never have made those kinds of revisions. I've had agents come back and tell me that they love the novel, they love the writing, they thought it was strong, they thought the characters were strong, but they couldn't market it. That's how I feel about it. So that's the painful part of the story. I spent probably a dozen years of my life working on that book, revising that book, turning it into what I think is still a really good novel. But I think in hindsight, I probably would have had a better job trying to actually sell the book if I had kind of kept its like queerness pure and intact. So I think now, like, one of the big takeaways from MFA programs for me is it's helped me as an educator because I'm really aware of the impact that we can have on somebody's voice. And it's helped me when I talk to, like, I have a friend, Indigenous woman, older woman who went back to school, like, after she'd already had a career, Cynthia Sylvester, and she has a collection coming out pretty soon that I'm really excited about. And she told me, I talked to her recently, and she had said that, and I hadn't remembered this, but she told me that when she was going to that MFA program, I had been really adamant to her to, like, not lose her voice, like, not let them, like, change your voice, because MFA programs could do that. They could have the potential, especially if you're a people pleaser, to make you kind of change your voice too much. So it's hard because you have to find the balance. Like, how do you take the growth as a writer? Like, I know I grew exponentially, but I didn't keep that boundary up around the things that I knew were part of my understanding of the world.
Thank you for sharing that. On your website, you shared your struggles as a queer person of color. Can you share how your identity as a queer Filipino American has influenced your writing?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've definitely gotten to the queerness. I mean, I think what's really interesting is that, like, as an intersectional person, I have a really hard time finding models, like, in other literature of things that have helped me see myself on the page, and the result has made it hard for me to capture different parts of my identity at the same time, right? So, like, my favorite writer as a high schooler was Amy Tan. Filipinos have a connection to like Chinese culture, right? Through like a pre-colonial influence. And then I also in college, I loved like Chicano literature, and like Sandra Cisneros was like one of my heroes. And I always bring those two up because what I was always trying to do, I'm realizing in hindsight, was I would hold up writers that were similar to me, right? So Mexican culture, Filipino culture, super similar in a lot of ways, colonized by the Spanish, pretty much colonized by Americans. And you feel a lot of that in the way that people are obviously very different, but there's a lot of similarities. And so I was like, I would try to find myself in between, right? In between Amy Tan and Cisneros, like somewhere in there is where I fit. And then I would see like, oh, here's Ana Castillo and she's queer. So then I would like put someone in there, like, here's Leslie Feinberg, like she's queer, right? So I would like, all of these were like all of these kinds of things. And they were like satelliting the like core self that I only have been able to get on the page in poetry. I think that's like, as a prose writer, I consider myself a prose writer, but for a span of time, I was really writing only poems, mostly because work got so busy and poems are shorter and I could focus on them. And I was upset about the novel and I needed a break from fiction. But there's something in fiction that I still struggle with. So I'm working on that. I have a current project that I'm working on that's like the closest thing to doing that. I think part of it for me is, and I can do it in short stories. Like I can have myself a little bit more in short stories, but even not then, they usually tend to be like a queer white character or a straight person of color. Like it's like like trying to put them all together has just been hard for me, and I interviewed someone on a podcast who was a Filipino writer, Elsa Valmagiano, last year. And I asked her, like, how do you write about being Filipino? And she said a lot of Filipinos ask her that question. And I mean, I think it's because there's not a lot of Filipino literature out there. So you can read Elsa. She's amazing. There's like Dog Eaters. That's like a famous book. And I think there's more, but when I was I studied as an undergrad, like multicultural literature, and there was nothing that ever touched on Filipino anything. So I think it's been, there is a weird thing about seeing yourself in literature that helps you kind of see that how to write that. I don't know how else to explain it. There's a great TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, Danger of a Single Story. Have you watched it?
I feel like I was introduced to that. Speak more on that.
Yeah, she, like a lot of people show it in composition classes here on campus. It's a great talk. One of the things she talks about, so she's Nigerian, and she talks about how I might get this wrong because it's been a minute, but one of the first stories she wrote, she had only been reading about like British writers.
Yes, was that when she was speaking about how her writing was basically through the lens of whiteness and how she wouldn't even consider writing about children eating mangoes?
Yes. So, I mean, I think that's what happened to me. And I think the project I'm working on right now, though, is the closest that I've come to write myself on to the page.
Besides becoming published as an undergraduate student, are there any other opportunities student writers should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think publishing is one thing. I have, I think, different feelings about publishing than others might. like I think as writers we can focus so much on publishing, and I think publishing is its own beast. But I think one thing that I personally find more important is being a good literary citizen. So, like, this is a term that I was introduced to a few years back. There was a panel of writers at the AWP conference, which is a big annual conference, Association of Writing and Writing Programs conferences, happening next week, actually, where there's a lot of panels, a lot of like big writers come and talk. And there was one panel, I can only remember one of the panelists. His name was Blas Falconer, but there were 3 or 4 others, and they were all phenomenal. I should go back and find their names. But they talked about like writerly envy and the problem of writer envy. You know, one of them talked about like they have a sister-in-law who is a nurse in an ICU unit, and she said that when she compares herself to her sister-in-law, herself as somebody who was disappointed about not getting a prize that she thought she should get as a public, has many novels, and her sister-in-law who like never does her work thinking she's going to get a prize, right? Even though she's like saving lives. So she really like had this like perspective of like what we really could be focusing on is how to be better at being community members to each other. And so I think that's something that I think is not talked about a lot. So, for example, we're having a conversation right now as writers. This is one way to be a good literary citizen is you like help lift up other writers. That's another piece of advice I got from the same conference. I saw Roxane Gay speak before she was like the household name Roxane Gay, and somebody asked her, you know, as a woman of color, like what can we do to like support other writers of color? And she said, well, anytime you get a step up, like put your hand down and lift somebody else up with you.
Yes.
And so that's, to me, more important than publishing, I think, is to like build community, to lift each other's voices up. Publishing can get you so competitive. It can make people feel like they don't belong in an environment. But publishing, like if we really think about it, like you work with the Vernal Pool, what publishing means is that those people who read that work at that moment in time liked that work. And it, you know, I worked many years on literary magazines, and one of my big takeaways was there was this contest that we had where I read this story it was a fiction contest. I read this story. I did not like it. My friend Dan was on my right. My friend Melanie was on my left. I passed it to the left. Melanie loved it. She knew somebody else in the room that would love it, and she passed it to somebody else, and that person passed it to somebody else. So it got the like yeses that it needed to move on to the final round. My friend Dan on my right, he hated it. Had I passed it to the right, he would have put a no on it, and it would never been published in our magazine. It would never have won the contest, right? So, I mean, I think that's why I don't focus so much on publishing, because I think to me, publishing can make you feel worse as a writer. It can make you feel discouraged. It's an important part of the process, because of course you want readers, but there's lots of ways to get your words out there. And to me, when you're young and you're finding your voice, like find the ways you can find it. Like find the ways you can get confident in it before you start trying to like sell it to somebody who might not have your voice.
Is there any advice you would like to share with student writers?
Yeah. What advice do I have for student writers? Play with writing. Like I think one of the things that happens when you do this long enough. So again, I was writing as a young kid, writing in classes whenever I could, took classes as an undergrad, took 4 years off in between, went and got my MFA. And then when I went to do the MFA, that was when I started to like take myself seriously. My first 2 years as an MFA student were just glorious. I was happy just to be writing. And then the publishing stuff starts to come in, and then you start seeing other people like get publications, and I never thought I would ever get jealous as a fellow writer. I remember like somebody talking about it, and I just thought, that's wild. Like, why would anybody get jealous about a friend getting published? And then it's just what happens. Like the more you do it, and especially because the rejections are such a big part of it. So my advice for students is like, don't rush the process. Like so many of us now, again, I'm probably a dozen years into taking myself seriously as a writer. We're trying to get back to where we were when we were students. Like we're trying to get back to loving it. We're trying to get back to like when I was an undergrad, we'd have friends and we'd be like, let's just go read our work together. And we would just like read it aloud at like, we'd be like, let's go to a coffee shop and write. And it was like the best day ever. Or, and I'll still do that, but it's just different now.
Yeah.
So I would just say like, enjoy it, like explore. Don't settle on one genre. Just play in all of the ways that you can possibly play. Learn what you can. Figure out what feels right for you. And then but as you do it, just look for where you are in that process.
I love that. That's inspiring. Thank you for taking time out of your day.
Happy to do it.
To come talk to our audience. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed that discussion as much as I did. If you are interested in seeing past editions of the Vernal Pool, check out our website, thevernalpool.ucmerced.edu, by clicking the link in the description. Past editions can also be found on our e-scholarship page, the link to which will also be in the description. UC Merced undergraduates who are interested in submitting their creative writing or visual art for publication can find detailed instructions on how to do so on our website. Submissions are due by the end of March. To make sure you catch future episodes of the Reflection Pool podcast, please consider subscribing to this channel. To connect further, please follow us on Instagram by clicking the link in the description or searching for @VernalPool_UCM on Instagram. Thank you again for listening. I look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. Bye.